Greetings and welcome to another edition of The Pedal Shift Project. The Pedal Shift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments on bicycle travel adventures. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/386, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedal Shift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 386th edition of the Pedal Shift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. On this edition, the takeaways episode for the NoDak Northern Tier Adventure. But before we dive into it, one last reminder, a series of reminders for you. Live show, Friday, December 6th. That is coming up soon at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific time. And all details are at pedalshift.net/live. I hope to see you all there for the final live show of 2024. We've got the best of that will be happening on the 19th. And for you Shifty the Elf fans, the Holiday Spectacular returns in its full glory once again for 2024 on December 26th. And that will close out the year. All right, so let's talk about this unique adventure, this Northern Tier adventure that I went on in the state of North Dakota. And I've got a bunch of different takeaways. It's the typical kind of takeaways episode. The first thing I want to mention, though, at the top here, and I will talk a little bit about this, I think that this was a little bit different. This was not a traditional bike tour. A bicycle was a part of this. It was not the featured part of this trip. And I'll be very curious to get feedback from you whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing. It was really important to me that I had the bike on this trip because it made the trip. Even though I think a lot of what we ended up covering in the adventure here on the pod was a lot more about the wildlife and things like that. I think the bike was such an important part because I was able to bike around the campground. I did have that sort of close encounter on the first day in the park with the bison from afar, of course. And of course, doing the Northern Tier on the second day was a really fun piece of it all. Not a lot of miles, but it was a really important part of the entire trip to me. I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing a ton of these types of bicycle adventures on the podcast, but I'm certainly curious if this was enough cycling for you. I think that there are a whole bunch of different opportunities for different types of cycling adventures that I can do on the podcast that aren't the I am biking all day and camping at the end of it. And I'm just curious what you think about all of that. So here are my takeaways for this grand adventure. The first one, by the way, these are of course in no particular order. Some of these may be more important to you than to me, or vice versa. First one is, folks, North Dakota is worth the trip. I obviously put this off for a really long time because for me and where I go and what I do, North Dakota is a tough place to get to. I think I always knew in the back of my head that the most likely way that I was going to get to North Dakota would be a trip to Minnesota. And of course, most of the time, any kind of a trip to Minnesota that would happen for me would be to Minneapolis. And that presented itself. And that's why I was so grateful for that work trip that got me close enough. And then it was, okay, yes, I will drive redonkulous distances to make this North Dakota thing happen. But at the end of the day, it was much more, or turned out to be much more to me than simply checking a box. I certainly could have done that. I could have done, as I mentioned on the podcast, a trip to Fargo, overnight there, and that's it. And that would have been enough. That would have counted the state for me. That's how I got Nebraska, to be perfectly honest, although I think I did a little bit more than that. The idea, though, of being able to do something in the state that's really part of its crown jewel, it was very much worth the trip, especially adding on that drive all the way across to Teddy Roosevelt National Park. It was well worth the trip. If you've got the interest, if you've got the ability, can't recommend it anymore. It really is probably one of my favorite national parks at this point that I've been to, just because it's just so stunning. And I have a particular affinity for bison, as we'll probably talk about more than once here on the takeaway episode. Takeaway number 2. When you're checking a bicycle, and when I say checking it, it's going into the belly of the beast of the aircraft. But I think that this would also apply for train travel or any other type of thing where you're giving the bike to somebody else. Pay attention to all of the vulnerable parts that jut out on it, and don't shirk corner padding. Why do I say this? Because my Brompton got a little bit damaged on the flight out, and I didn't realize it until really when I got to North Dakota. And it took me to folding the bike back again to realizing that rear rack wheel, which is what it sits on when it's in the tucked in position, that it was really bent out of shape. I was very lucky that was the only thing that happened. In fact, I actually have a spare wheel that replaced it, and there was no other damage to it. But I got lucky in the sense that was the exposed thing that took the brunt of whatever blow that it took. And I think that my takeaway for this is, A, I've gotten lucky when I've gate checked my bike before, but B, it's just really important to know that everything that juts out is subject to getting hit with enough force that it could bend or break. And that's why we do a bunch of things when we check Bromptons, when we take off some other vulnerable parts, and they tend to be the clips that hold the bike together when it is in bike mode. To take those off completely, I've said, oh, why is that necessary? Even though I've done it every time. Now I know. And I think that for any future situation where I take the Brompton and check it, I'm going to do exactly what the takeaway says, and that is, one, I am going to remove those wheels to begin with. It takes a minute to do. It's super easy. It's a hex bolt kind of a thing. I think it's super necessary to do. And then the other thing I'm going to do is, rather than just throw the thing in a bag and say, that's going to be fine, I think I'm going to pay more attention to the corners and the edges of this bike. And I've looked at a lot of different videos. And when I say a lot of videos on how to pack your Brompton. And I've often been like, oh my gosh, this is just overkill. You don't need to do that. And I think that the answer is somewhat in the middle. When you're traveling with a Brompton and you're trying to stay self-contained, as I frequently am, often riding off from the airport itself, having too much stuff is an impediment. So I've got to start thinking about, what can I do that is a disposable or semi-disposable or recyclable type of thing that I can bring with me to create that extra bit of padding, and what else can I easily procure on the other side of it as well. That might be something as simple as buying a pool noodle, although I would hate to buy something like that because they don't really recycle and I don't really want to just throw them out, to any of a variety of different things that maybe I do end up taking with me. I end up hauling around a duffel bag, for crying out loud. Maybe I should do some padding as well. So more to come on that. That's probably going to be something that I'll talk about, shall we say, the next time I take my Brompton out on a trip, which I think I've already given away the story on that. But next month, you're going to hear so much more about that trip. Takeaway number 3. I have to tell you, wild bison are worth seeing in person, but as we discovered in the final episode there, or actually was it the final or the third part, don't expect them to get out of your way. Gandalf, the bison, did not move for anything, was not interested. And I think that the reason was, I can't recall if I mentioned it at the time, it was cold. It was in the 20s Fahrenheit when this was all happening. And it was catching a lot of sun, just standing there, just absorbing the sun's radiation and heating up. I think that's why it was. It had no reason to move out of the way. But I will say, they are majestic. They are amazing. As I mentioned on the show, they are the largest land mammals in North America. They are special. It is no wonder to me that indigenous peoples of North America had them be a major part of their life. And they were super important. And I'm again going to recommend the American Buffalo documentary, the Ken Burns documentary. I really think that's worth seeing. It's on your PBS app. I don't know if it gets rebroadcast a lot. It should. It's excellent. And as a person who grew up near Buffalo, New York, I've always been drawn to the American buffalo, bison. And I thought it was a really special experience to be able to get as close as you literally can/should to these little beasties. And they're not little. And just how awesome that was. I changed my phone wallpaper for one of the bison that I saw. This was the one that I talked about quite a bit, that was literally in the campsite directly across from mine, just sitting there chilling. And that bison has now been on my phone for all of these months later as I record this. And yeah, I think that there's some really interesting trips that I could make bike tours out of. I've already looked up where other wild bison herds are, and there are some obviously in some other national parks, but there are some in some state parks and some other federal public lands as well. So that might be something to consider. Of course, as you might imagine, there are a lot in the Great Plains and in the West. We really don't have them on the East Coast to speak of that are wild, but something to potentially pursue. Again, another thing to take some time, especially if you're not based in the US or Canada. They are something special to behold. I can't say enough about good old bison. Next one, Teddy Roosevelt National Park is an excellent place to bike, but be aware that bison can and do come into the roadway and might scuttle your riding plans. This is part parcel with the last one. The one thing that I took away from this trip, it was too cold for me to bike that one morning, so I'm glad I had the opportunity to be able to explore the park by motor vehicle. But no matter what, Gandalf was not going to let me pass regardless of conveyance. If I had the bike, actually, I would be worried that I would startle that bison into potentially charging or whatever, because there was no way to go around it. I don't know if I could have gone around that beautiful buffalo safely. I certainly couldn't have done it 75 feet. The road wasn't that wide. And I definitely didn't feel comfortable taking the motor vehicle, the Jeep, around them because it was just so tight. And yeah, I'm not going to mess with that. They are protected species. That is a protected place. And no, you're not going to mess around with that. If you were cycling, I would say that the terrain is actually really not terrible. Obviously, there are some climbs in there, but considering it's the Badlands, actually, I think it was fairly doable. There are a couple of places where the terrain goes into climbing mode, especially if you've been doing the Northern Tier. You have done some climbing already, so you would be well equipped to be able to do it. I think that the loop road, should the loop be actually open, is a fantastic ride. It is 40 miles long, so that would be an interesting, not a 0 day, actually close to maybe the type of mileage you would be doing in a day anyways. But I would recommend taking a day or 2 or 3 off and really exploring the park, and maybe taking one of those days and doing the 40-mile loop from camp if that's up your alley. I think it's fantastic. I'm so glad that I was able to do what I could when I biked on the first day, even though it wasn't very long. I found, of course, I ran into that other bison on the first day. So you got to be prepared to turn around, honestly, when they are in the way. When I was reading about this park, and I've read a lot about this park for a very long time, the suggestion was, oh yeah, the bison come out and they hang out in the campgrounds and they're on the roads and stuff, so you got to be careful. And I've been to Yellowstone and I've seen that as well. I've been to some other places where there are wild American buffalo. But this was way more than I expected. I went into this thinking it'd be awesome if I could at least see some from a distance. And of course, as you all heard, I saw a lot more, and they were super close. And they were almost a little too close. It ended up scuttling some of my ability to bike the park. So I would say it's a great place to bike, but be prepared to not bike as much as you would like because of the wildlife, because the wildlife could interfere with all of that. Next one, the Northern Tier route is a good place to bike if you enjoy solitude. The small portion of the route that I rode was obviously in Medora, which was a beautiful town, quirky, cowboyish, the thing that I thought Fargo might have been, but very much different than that. But when I was driving on I-94, and the Northern Tier route parallels I-94 for a good chunk of it, there is a whole lot of very beautiful but very remote land that you're going to be cycling on. And you're going to be going a fair distance between towns. Now, it's not wildernessy by any stretch of the imagination. There are definitely going to be towns that you'll be riding through every single day, multiple towns probably, depending on where. But that's definitely going to be a ride that if you're not riding with someone, and when I say with, like next to each other, then you are going to be alone in your thoughts for a lot of that trip. For some of us, like me, I think that's a feature, not a bug. But if that's not your bag, then I would say factor it in. Factor that in terms of your choices. But I think that now seeing the Northern Tier, it really gives me a sense of what I would be in for if I rode some of that. I should mention that I've talked about, I was supposed to ride the Northern Tier route a lot. I was actually supposed to ride a section of the Northern Tier and a section of the Lewis and Clark route. That was another route that splits off. I believe it's in Missoula, if I'm not mistaken. It may be in another spot in Montana. But yeah, up that direction, there's just some interesting routes that the Adventure Cycling Association has. So take a look at the ACA. I think that's a really good resource for you for the Northern Tier or for any other American bike route. They have excellent stuff. And also, as I mentioned on the show, the Northern Tier route has been altered within the last 10 years, and for good reason. The changes in what happened in where they're fracking in North Dakota made for a change in the traffic patterns and the types of vehicles that were on the original route. And they very wisely, and I think in a great way, changed that Northern Tier route for the better. You don't go through certain parts of truly northern North Dakota now. You're further south now, but it routes you through Medora, it routes you through some really wonderful places too. So I think it's great that the ACA continues to monitor all of their routes. And so if you're coming from somewhere far away, whether you're from within the US or Canada or elsewhere, you can rely on the fact that they are keeping an eye on safety for every single bit of the route. And I think that that's really important too. Next up, this is the second to last of my takeaways. Bike adventures can mean a lot of things. And I think that this gets back to what I talked about at the top here. You can look at bicycle adventures and bike touring and bike packing as you're on the bike and it is the primary thing that you're doing. And we've talked about this on the show a bunch before, that for some people, it's all about the cycling. For some people, it's cycling to get to the next campsite because they're more focused in on the camping aspects of it. And for a trip like this, I think that you can argue that sometimes you can have a bike more like a spice. It's something else that you're doing as a part of your trip. And I think that a bike like a Brompton is a fantastic type of thing for that. And that's really what was so helpful about it for this trip. It was easy to stow. It was easy to have in my hotel rooms. It was easy to move around. It was easy to unfold and ride. And so for this type of a bicycle adventure, the Brompton was a handy type of a thing. But yeah, that's why I think that I've shifted the focus of this podcast away from just about bicycle touring, because that is a very specific thing, I think, to a lot of people now, even though I always looked at it as a bit of an umbrella term. But I do think that having a bicycle be a part of your adventure can mean so many different things. And so that's why I'm glad that I was able to experiment a little bit with this type of an adventure, to be able to make the bicycle a piece of this wild thing that I did, to go to a place that I really wanted to go to, and to be able to bike around in a little bit was really special to me. And I think made this trip all the better. And so I hope that I hope you feel the same way. I feel pretty strongly about that bicycle adventures can mean a lot of things. All right, last but not least, the final takeaway. Our national parks are treasures. And when I say our, of course, I'm going to be a little US centric here, but I think every national park, regardless of where you live in the world, they're treasures. They are worth protecting. But I also want to say that, when shifting back to US centric, so are our state parks. So are our federal public lands. They're all really, really important. They are our legacy. In the US, we all co-own these things, not from an ownership perspective, but they are a part of who we are and our identity. And I look at what we do when we decide collectively that places are worth protecting, not just for us to see in the here and now, but to preserve and enhance so that our kids, your kids, my nieces and nephews, and maybe their kids and their kids and their kids are all going to be able to see the same type of bison habitat and the heritage of the bison that follow. Maybe they'll see the great grand bison that I saw by going to Teddy Roosevelt National Park down the line. But protecting, I think that this type of habitat, and by extension, these types of majestic creatures and all of the different type of wildlife that was around there, I think it's super important. And every time I go to particularly national parks, but really any place where it's a protected place, I'm always caught in my thoughts about how grateful I am that that place exists and that those things were preserved. Because when you go to other places where development happens and all sorts of other things happen, it's really impossible to protect those types of things. And they do have value. And that's why I feel pretty strongly about this. I work in my day job with a particular organization that does a lot of work with the national parks. And I always love doing that kind of work because it matters so much to me personally. So it's always great to help them out. So yeah, national parks are such a wonderful thing. And I know that there's going to be a lot of talk about what they mean in the future. And I just like to make my pitch saying, hey, they matter. They matter to us and they matter to people who aren't born yet. And that's why I think it's a good thing. Oh, also, they probably matter to the bison too. And I'm down with them lately. All right, that's it. That's the takeaways here for the NoDak adventure. And thank you so much for joining on this one. This one meant a lot to me. I really liked this one particularly because it was a new place. This checked another box in terms of the goals for the year of doing something in a totally different place. And I'm so glad that I was able to do that and to bring you along for the ride once again. We've got so many other adventures coming up, and I don't want to spoil things, but maybe I'm going to spoil this just a little bit here. I've already gone on another adventure since I recorded this. Since I went on the North Dakota adventure, I went on another one. But I don't have time to share it with you this year. So it's going to be coming next year. And it's a little one, and it was a fun one, and it was cool and everything. But I'm really grateful that I've had so many opportunities here this year to get out on a bike and do something cool. And I'm really glad that I'll be able to share that with you, but you're going to have to wait on that one. But don't worry about it. There's that one. There's another one coming up. We've got a whole bunch of things that are coming down the pike. But before that, we've got a live show, as I mentioned, coming up. We have, of course, got another best of. And of course, Shifty the Elf is going to be coming in for the holiday spectacular to wrap up the year. So stick around. We've got so many more awesome things to come here on the show.
And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedal Shift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedal Shift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community. Expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options if you're not into the small monthly thing. Check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Didis, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joaquin Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Bigel, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Grotke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullum, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Azuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson, Cyrus Faravar, John Gardner, Sam Scruggs, Dwight Pintinger, Connie Bowder, Rob Merrifield, and thanks to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedal Shift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedal Shift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.